Hello everyone and welcome to the GALA Annual Conference for 2021, Liberal Arts for Tomorrow. This is the first session and this first session is part of Block A on the first day of the conference, Monday the 20th of September. My name is John Strachan, Pro Vice-Chancellor at Bath University and the Executive Director of the Global Academy of Liberal Arts. A few housekeeping kind of notices, just to let you know that we are recording all of the presentations at our conference. These won't be shared publicly or put on YouTube or anything like that, but they will be available to all registered attendees until the end of October. So if you miss a plenary or a session that interests you, catch up with it later. Please ensure that you keep your videos and your microphones off during the presentations. Feel free to unmute during the Q&A. To raise questions for our speakers, please put them in the first instance in the Zoom chat during the talk, and we will take them at the Q&A which follows the talk. You can also use Zoom's raise your hand feature during the Q&A. We'll share all of your comments and questions with our speaker. I should also encourage you afterwards to use the wonder.me social space for further discussion during the conference. That's now up and running. Ian and I were there for 3/4 of an hour from 8 o'clock, and it's a really good way in which you can talk to your friends and colleagues on the conference. So our first plenary speaker is Professor Sue Rigby, who is the Vice-Chancellor of Bath University. A paleontologist by training, Sue has an MA from Oxford University and a PhD from Cambridge. And after working as an academic at Cambridge, Leicester and Edinburgh, she moved into senior academic leadership roles. She's now in her 4th year as Vice-Chancellor at Bath University. Before that, she was Deputy Vice-Chancellor at the University of Lincoln, and even before that, Vice Principal at the University of Edinburgh. So welcome, Sue. Sue's presentation today is entitled, How Can Liberal Arts Universities Contribute to Pandemic Recovery? So welcome, Sue.
Thanks very much, John. And apologies for that biography. All it really says is that I've travelled around a lot and I'm very old. But I really wanted to kick us off today with this wonderful opportunity to think internationally by thinking with you about this enormous thing that we've just gone through. If you think back to, let's say, 2018, if you'd had to guess what the defining context of this century would be, you might have thought something about the rise of China, something about the climate emergency, little kind of wars and disturbances going on. But looking back from the perspective where we are now, it's absolutely clear that one of the defining characteristics of this century will be the COVID pandemic and the different responses to that in different parts of the world. And of course, the very differentiated effect of the pandemic on different parts of the globe. So what I wanted to do was kick off by giving you a perspective from one location, Bath Spa in Somerset in England, and then really to invite you to think about the ways in which my observations match yours, and much more interestingly, the ways in which they don't. Because I think that one of the things that GALA can do is really start to engage with this wide array of different reflections and consequences of something that's singular, the pandemic. So that's what I'm hoping to achieve. Even more immediately, I'm hoping to achieve a sharing of my screen so you can see some pictures. And that means that even if you have your camera on, you're nice and small and you can get on with catching up with paperwork if I don't engage you very effectively. So let's see if we can get some pictures. There, can you see a slide that says, how can liberal arts universities?
It's coming through loud and clear, Sue.
Excellent. So this was the question that I took as a starter for 10. What I quickly realised was that if I was going to say anything at all that's meaningful to people as widespread geographically as you all are, what I had to do was be very honest. I can only give you the response of the pandemic of our university. And reflections on how I think the pandemic has affected England. But I think there's enough commonality there with all the different places that GALA represents, or that are represented within GALA, to have some commonality and interestingly, as I said, some differences. So I thought really this question divides into four, really. Where are we now as the pandemic appears to be, in most places, receding? What are the main challenges that we face as institutions and as members of society? And what are the main challenges facing the societies into which we have a role to contribute? No university, I think, these days imagines that it sits separately or unlinked to the economy that sustains it. So anything that affects us necessarily affects the economies around us, and anything that affects those economies is something that we have a role to address. And then exactly that, what is our role in the recovery from this pandemic, accepting that it's probably not over yet, but we've probably had the largest and most impactful start. And what we'd expect, I guess, going forward are a series of less and less dramatic waves as the pandemic evolves and battles against the vaccination, and as the vaccine rollout is obviously differentiated in different places in both its speed and its spread. What's really struck me over the last couple of months in the UK press is how quickly people appear to have put the pandemic behind them. We've got plans for autumn resurgences and so on, but lots of people now are starting to reflect on the last couple of years as though we hadn't all done 3 lockdowns and seen the economy absolutely stall in its tracks and lost huge numbers of loved ones, particularly the elderly, and particularly in care home settings. It's almost as if we've got to look forward now and we can't look back. So this is an image that I want to show several times. This is just as of the beginning of September, the number of confirmed coronavirus cases per country, which is just a staggering outbreak. There's nowhere unaffected, and very few places not severely affected by COVID. And yet, just to give you an example, there's an article in the Times newspaper this morning, obviously reflecting on students about to go to university for the start of our semester, our autumn semester, saying, how did universities fail students last year? And it talks about how, you know, shock horror, universities taught online last year and they didn't offer in-person teaching. This was terrible and students were upset and they didn't like it. But of course, that's what we had to do because the government shut down the economy. And for quite a long time, we were all told to stay at home. So quite how else we could have taught in the pandemic is a mystery to us. But really, that was just a slightly silly, perhaps, example of how I think governments are failing to reflect on the necessities of the last year, and equally failing to reflect on the impact of the last 18 months on individuals, as well as on businesses, communities, and societies. In terms of us as a university, where has it left Bath Spa? And my guess is it's left all of us in a fairly similar position. And I've got some slides to unpack some of these in a minute, just so you feel better about wherever it is that you are. The first thing is it's cost us a lot of money. When we locked down at Christmas, we paid a full refund to all of our students who were in our own accommodation because they couldn't use the accommodation that they paid for. And we reckoned that a university was in a much better position to dig into its pockets than our students were. But that means that we'll post a deficit at the end of last year when we submit our accounts of about £3 million. And whilst we have the reserves to deal with that, we can't carry on with that kind of attrition. So I think most institutions are poorer, whether it be through refunds to students, whether it be through a failure to recruit as many international students as they might have wanted, or just because teaching online, regardless of what governments say or think, is actually very expensive. It costs a lot more than just doing the normal teaching we would otherwise have done. And I think increasingly, as I was considering the effect of the pandemic on us as an institution, I was thinking, actually, this is not that far off the effect of the pandemic on the wider society, because there's no question that as a society and an economy, we were also poorer. I think on the upside, though, we're a lot more agile. If before the pandemic, someone had gone to any of our institutions and said, we're going to pivot from face-to-face teaching to entirely online teaching in 6 days, we'd just have laughed pityingly at the idea that that was possible. But actually we did it. We did it not once, but I think 5 times, pivoting backwards and forwards. So we ought to be able to capitalise on that, because if we go back to being as slow and ponderous as we were, then we're foolish, because we may be in a world now that we understand far less well than we did before. The pandemic, I think, has also reframed our values, though as a community at Bath Spa, we have yet to unpack that to the full extent that we need to. There's a sort of phrase in the colloquial English that we certainly use in the university about describing how things matter, how much things matter. And you tend to say, well, nobody dies. I mean, come on, if we get the timetable wrong, nobody dies. Actually, over the last year, we've been dealing with life and death choices around how we keep COVID at bay in our teaching and learning context and yet still do our core job. We are teaching people now who have experienced the kind of levels of loss that you wouldn't expect until you were in your 50s or 60s. And we're also dealing with people who have, in a sense, lost their sense of themselves. Particularly, I think, as a student, your sense of who you are can change dramatically in a year of study. And yet for the last year and a half, most of those people have been physically constrained to living in one place. They've been learning and teaching from a very small space, a bedroom or a very small study area. And their reflections on who they are and what they value have radically changed from any student body that we've ever seen before. And equally, academics who've been trying to juggle childcare and teaching still keep their research alive and engage with the outside world to the maximum extent they can. I think many of them have decided that the value sets that they owned previously aren't quite the value sets that they bring to bear today. And we still have a long way to go to unpack that, and it's part of our job as a community to do it. And then we have very disappointed students. There's no way that they got the education last year that they wished. What I'm sure they did get was the best education we could deliver in the circumstances. But it's been very rough for them. And the anger that comes from that is a legitimate anger. And we need to work with that and not despite it. And then finally for us, and I'm sure for all of you as well, very worried staff. Some staff who are clinically vulnerable, some who've lost people close to them, all of whom now being required to come into spaces with lots of students and teach them. And again, that's not a worry that we should put aside lightly. So just to kind of highlight some of those in a bit more detail, this is our waterfall diagram for last year. And you'll see there's an awful lot more decreasing funding than increasing. And the financial state at the end, rather less good than the financial state at the beginning. None of this is confidential, though it would be a kindness if you didn't show this on your websites, for example. But really what I wanted to show was the diverse ways in which the pandemic leached money away from higher education. And I'm sure that in all of your institutions, you have something the same. We can bear this for a period of time, but in a post-pandemic world, we also have to turn our mind to how we repair this financial damage. And that means that decisions that we might perhaps in other circumstances have delayed or minimised are now much more real to us than they were before. In terms of agility, and there is of course a closed book exam on this slide before you're allowed to leave for the next breakout session, we developed a series of 5 stages of lockdown. Different stages had different impacts on teaching, the library, well-being and so on. And we moved between these as the government instructed us to. I think just being able to construct something like this was really impressive because it shows how well we understand the functions of our own university. And just to be clear, I've been in a senior management position, as John mentioned, for at least a decade now. But I don't think in any other institution I've been at, I could have overseen the construction of something this detailed that showed the workings of what we do. And I think it's a huge testimony to my colleagues that we were able to do this. And we have very successfully moved from level 1, which was complete shutdown, but still teaching online, to stage 5, which is broadly getting as near back to normal as we can, but still with some online provision where otherwise people would meet in very large groups in very poorly ventilated spaces. And if we can do this now, there's no reason why we ever need to stop being this agile. In terms of students, and I put this slide in not least because I think any slide that is given by a senior manager in university should have some students in it. We had our graduations on campus over the last 2 weeks, and it's the first time that A, we've seen lots of students in groups, and B, we've seen this look of complete joy on their faces. And it wasn't really until I could sort of see students having fun that I realised through all the Zoom sessions we've run, through all the encounters with students that we've had over the last year, I've not seen these expressions. I've not seen them delighted or thrilled or elated or passionate. I'm sure those have been characteristics of the last 18 months, but they haven't been the predominant characteristic. So as we get back to normal, that's great. But I think if we don't also reflect on what we've just been through, people will be left with a hole, a gap in their understanding both of themselves and their learning journey, which would be a danger to them actually going forward, because gaps like that are spaces where mental ill health and challenge, I think, start to grow. So as a university, what are our main challenges? We have to work out what our new normal looks like. Partly that's a very prosaic normal. We might carry on teaching large lectures online because actually students like them online. And we all know that experience of turning up in a university building in a very large lecture, sitting somewhere near the back and quietly just waking up for the hour while the person at the front droned on. It was rarely the kind of high quality, innovative and shocking learning experience that we might wish to deliver. So some of this stuff we might keep online. But some of it, clearly, the bulk of our learning and teaching needs to be done in person, because what the pandemic reminded us is that learning is a communal action. It's not something that you do in a solitary fashion to the same level of efficacy. Even if you like learning by yourself, in the end, it needs to be something that you share with others. So part of that is what new normal looks like for learning and teaching, but also, I think, for what a university comprises. How we co-create the future with our students, how we interact with local economies, how we look to recruit students and retain them, how we look to support both staff and students. So the next challenge I think we have is how to settle our students and staff back into face-to-face learning and teaching. And that should be a very short problem. And I'm not sure what the longer learnings will be, but it could also be that the pandemic resurges as the winter comes on in the northern hemisphere, and it might be that we go through a stage of partial or complete lockdowns in future, in which case that settling will have to happen multiple times. We have to think how to capitalise on that agility, because when I look back, for example, at our academic board, which governs the academic activities of the university, you see things in there like an intention to close the awarding gap between different groups of students within 3 years. And I look at that now and I think that's ridiculous. You know, if we can go from face-to-face to online teaching in 6 days, why do we think it's going to take us 3 years to make sure that everybody learns and teaches on a level playing field? We should be able to do that in a week. So how do we capitalise on that agility? How do we rebuild our finances? Particularly, as with most of us, where we can't set fees to any level that we choose, but are constrained by the economic decisions of the governments under which we operate. And how do we develop those new values so that they don't make us risk averse and nervous, and I think focused on loss, but rather make us reflective and aware of our own resilience going forward? And again, what I'd highlight is that although at the moment what I'm talking about is internal challenges to the university, you could look down that list and think, actually, that's not far off the kind of challenges that societies are facing more widely. What's the new normal for society? How do you settle the members of that society back into the new normal? How do you capitalise on the fact that government has made absolute diktat changes to the way we were allowed to live, and may or may not wish to do that going forward? How as a country do we rebuild our economy? And how as a nation do we think about values going forward? So internally, we're doing some very practical things. We know that some students decided to withdraw from study for a year, and so we've developed a completely new pathway to bring them back into full-time learning. We called it Reignite. And amongst all the cogs and wheels that you can see on the right-hand side of that diagram, there's a whole series of activities that are designed to bring people back into study who have left it generally under some degree of stress. So I was talking to our Reignite students a week or so ago, and they fell into really two categories. One category was they were stuck somewhere a very long way from Bath Spa and decided simply to remain there, not try to study online, but capitalise on the opportunities of being, in one case in Nigeria, in another in Holland, and then return to study. That was the minority. The other half effectively said, study in the pandemic was impossible for me. And I gradually came to realise that if I was to finish my education, it wouldn't be in this way. And for those people, they should be able to bring back into their studies a real sense of self-awareness. How many of us have had the courage to both see that something isn't working and to act on that understanding quickly enough to do something about it? But the worry would always be that rather than that, they come back with a sense of being inadequate, not quite good enough. They're with a cohort that doesn't seem to have had a problem, and they know they've had a problem. So we're doing a lot of work with those students, not just to help them back into study, but to help them realise how phenomenal they are, how brilliant and bold their actions have been in the year, where otherwise they might have seen themselves just to be not doing very well. And I think in a microcosm way, that's the kind of work that we need to do with many people through the pandemic, to help them to realise that some of the choices they made that weren't grand or heroic were nevertheless brave and resilient, and give them actually a tool for the future that they wouldn't otherwise have had. We're also aware that students returning to study are going to have much more significant and much more severe challenges to their mental health than any cohort we've ever had before. There's probably nothing worse for your own mental health than not getting to talk to people for a year, not getting to do anything, no displacement activities, and just that ongoing sense of being alone with yourself and the stress of trying to study. So we've joined a nationwide programme called the University Mental Health Charter that will allow us to take a whole university approach where there's no excuse for not thinking about the mental health of our students first in all of the decisions we make. And we recognise that we're on a journey to this. We won't get it right immediately, but the intention is very bold. It's to think before we commit to an estate strategy or an IT strategy, before we decide what to teach or how we teach it, to start by thinking, what will the impact of this be on the mental health and well-being of students? And to put that as a key decision-making driver to the whole university's behaviours. And they might be investment behaviours, or they may be just being nice to people in a corridor. But the whole point is to put the students and their well-being first. So it's a start. It's not sufficient, but it's a beginning. We're also aware that staff have had huge problems in terms of their mental health and well-being over the last 18 months, not least the high number of our staff who have children at school and who found that schooling was so disrupted that they have had no work-life balance for the last year or even 18 months. So we've trained 65 staff as mental health first aiders, and we're training more with the intention of giving peers the capacity and the confidence to support each other as we move through this discussion about mental health and the impact of the pandemic. And there's a degree to which I think we are likely to focus in the media and indeed in our response to the pandemic on things that you can count. Economic impacts are very obvious, but actually I wonder if the mental health impact on the population at large, as well as on the university, will be the most damaging long-term effect of this unprecedented event. We're starting a series of online events called Talk It Out, where we can just look at difficult issues. This was a slightly esoteric first off, but the hope is to look at issues like loss, bereavement, anger, grief, and be in a position to talk through some of the issues that we've encountered over the last 18 months. So that's what we're doing internally as a university. And then when I came to think about how that maps onto what societies need to do, I think actually there's quite a good level of map. So what are the main challenges that face our societies at this stage in the pandemic? There's clearly an economic crisis. There's clearly been a huge amount of bereavement and loss, and also the anger that comes from an underlying sense that a lot of that bereavement was unnecessary if governments had been able to react more effectively in the early stages of the pandemic. I think underlying this, there's a confusion of purpose. A lot of things that seemed to matter a lot before we went into the pandemic. In England, Brexit would be a good example, leaving the European Union. On this side of the pandemic seemed slightly smaller and slightly more esoteric, you know, almost like we just repainted a bedroom and then the house got blown up. It doesn't quite seem to be as important as it used to be. And I think there's a more insidious problem around this, which is what I'd certainly notice at the moment is a real rise of anger in the way that people are interacting with one another. So, you know, a small example would be that a climate change action group is blocking the M25, the main orbital motorway around London, bringing it to a halt every 2 days in order to get across a message that we should insulate our houses better, which is unquestionably a really important thing to do. But what they're generating is an enormous sense of anger, both amongst green activists and amongst the people who are stuck on the M25. And if I look at the rhetoric around universities, what I'm seeing is a lot of anger. Universities accused of failing students, accused of anti-Semitism, accused of banning free speech, accused of promoting what in England is known as the woke agenda, and what I would say is the liberal egalitarian exploration of ways of thinking. In that confusion of purpose, I think there is a real capacity for extremism to blossom. And I think we'll be very lucky if that extremism is limited to shutting a big motorway or shouting at universities. And I think it's a melting pot for the kind of extremism that Europe has been lucky enough to avoid for the last 70 years in the main, at least Western Europe. I think as well for society, there's a lack of long-term goals and ambition. What are you going to do? We've not got survivor's guilt, I think, but we have a sort of survivor's exhaustion. Signing up to things like the AUKUS treaty seem bizarre. They come out of nowhere. There's no narrative to bring us to where we are. And so no clear goal or purpose to where we're going. And I think we need to build back that and really take this opportunity, if we can, as thought leaders, to guide that sort of exploration of long-term goals, both to avoid extremism and perhaps to reposition things on the political agenda in a different way, in a way that better suits the people that we talk to and the things that we value. So we know, for example, that climate change is probably the most important challenge that we face as nations and indeed as a globe in the next 60 years. But we can also see that with COP26 approaching, every government that you can name is starting to put in caveats and worries about being able to afford it. And I think, you know, one of our clear goals and ambitions should be that governments start to look at the cost of not being able to afford to remediate climate change rather than the cost of doing it. It's not optional. But I think there is that lack of long-term vision at the moment, and that rise of divisive views that really frightens me, though that might just be because all the guides for universities have been coming out and it's felt a bit more personal over the last few days than it normally does. So just to clear away the words, this is what we've been dealing with. I won't show it anymore, but I think it's so easy to forget once it appears to be over. So what's the role of universities in that wider economic and societal regeneration? I think you could effectively constrain it into these elements. I think we have an absolute duty to enact thought leadership. If we accept that society is confused and angry, to an extent rudderless, often being steered by governments that are condemned for having dealt with the pandemic poorly and are now defensively trying to engage much too rapidly with what the future looks like in order to guarantee electoral success, we must be part of generating a thought leadership that makes sure that we take time to think about what matters as a society and that we don't jump into an extreme view too easily in this new, angry, rapid, agile environment. We have a duty to look at our own curriculum and to develop it so that it both fits graduates for a post-pandemic world, but also helps the local economies where we are kind of sited to recover from the pandemic. Arguably, looking at the example of Bath, you have an enormous workforce trained in retail, tourism, and events management. And it may be that we go back to the same kinds of tourism and people visiting Bath that we had in the past, but it may also be that some of that doesn't return. And as a university, we have a role to play in making sure that those people can reskill and transskill so that their future is as rosy or better than their past was. We have to develop support for graduates who are graduating into a world where there are lots of jobs, but very few are good jobs. So at the moment in England, there's something like 1 million job vacancies, but my guess would be that around 800,000 of those are stacking shelves and serving people in restaurants. And there's no harm in doing that. And indeed, it's a privilege to work in any environment and do it well. But that isn't what the aspirations of our graduates looked like when they embarked on their studies. And particularly for us as liberal arts universities, our students aren't in the main scientists or health workers, and they have a huge role to play in the society that's to come after the pandemic, but it might take them a little bit longer to find their feet. So, for example, we know that the arts and cultural sector has been devastated by the pandemic. There's no question that it'll rebuild because it's essential to society and people are happy to spend money on it and happy to financially support it. But just at the moment, people who previously were very successful actors, for example, have been driving delivery vans. And our students who aren't yet successful actors will have to kind of compete in a world where people who should be a lot further on in their careers have been knocked back. So just as one example, we need to support our graduates in a way we've never done before. I think we also need to reach out and form partnerships with companies, with healthcare, with all the different provisions with local schools in our own areas. So for example, we're working at the moment on a plan to provide digital training for our local hospital, where they've realised that they have an almost inexhaustible need for training in all of the digital literacies. There's a huge investment in England in the healthcare sector in digitisation, but nobody remembered that you have to actually teach people to use this stuff. So we're reaching out very much more directly than we would ever have done pre-pandemic. I think before the pandemic, we'd have thought, oh, well, you know, the health sector's got a problem. I wonder how they're going to solve that. Post-pandemic, we think the health sector has a problem. How can we contribute to that? How can we contribute to the solution to that? And generally, I think we have a duty to become part of the solution and not just to commentate on it, though commentary is important. I think before the pandemic, lots of elements of business in a society existed independent of one another, and the links between them were implicit, but they were never explicit. So universities, the press, governance, government, local government, regional government, national government, the drivers of the economy in terms of business, and also the business areas of local council authorities and national authorities. All of those areas, and there are many more going into, you know, thought leadership around religion, around philosophy and so on. They all existed, but they weren't put together. They'd sort of evolved. Society had developed different silos in which to think creatively. in which to worship, in which to enact economic change. And I think post-pandemic, what we're all faced with is not a society with a series of compartments. It's a society in need of a solution. And all of those compartments have to be part of that solution. Otherwise, I think we risk being completely irrelevant at the end of this. And we, equally, by being irrelevant, would risk our own long-term future. If we can be part of the solution, we have to be able to be a part also in driving that solution. And if there's any kind of merit to the argument that I've been developing, universities are arguably the best bastion between societies and extremism, or societies and thoughtless actions. And so if we can both enact that thought leadership and be part of the solution, we might change things at this pivotal moment. If we don't do that, I don't know who else steps in to do it. So again, just a few examples from Bath Spa. In terms of that, allowing society to come to grips with what it's gone through, to understand its process of loss and shock and anger and horror and frustration and hopelessness. We've all got a role to play in that thought leadership. And whilst all of us enact academic thought leadership at all times, I think as liberal arts universities, we can also contribute in really unusual ways. So this slide shows a piece of music created by one of our students based on COVID graphs and presented to society in order that by listening to this, they just give themselves, everybody can give themselves a bit of space to reflect on what they've gone through. And any proceeds from the score will go to NHS charities. But for me, this is the perfect example of putting something reflective and creative and truly to do with the liberal arts in between the fact that we've had a lot of death and loss and illness, and the fact that the NHS is in crisis, our health service is in crisis. We need to put something in between to give us time to think, or else we'll make poor decisions. So to me, this is the best kind of thought leadership, where we don't in any way tell people what to do, because that doesn't tend to go down well. What we do is help people to take the time to think better themselves than they would otherwise have been able to do. In terms of looking at our curriculum, we very quickly moved to the development of short courses, linking up with national institutions like the Institute of Coding to develop, for example, digital skills boot camps. We've been able to capitalise on local and national opportunities for funding for these, but the demand for them is enormous. So many people have a set of skills now that are no longer relevant to the jobs that they wish to do. And need very quickly to acquire the skills that will allow them to move into the jobs they wish to hold in the future. And by doing this, we both start to repair our own finances, which is very welcome to me as the Vice-Chancellor, but also we start to help society. And I think we have to start thinking about ourselves as contributors to that larger endeavour, as well as entities that do well in and of and for themselves. In terms of supporting graduates, we've created this scheme called Emerge, where we are offering internships, where we're offering financial support for recent graduates so that they don't give up on their vocations too quickly. We recognise that most people, for example, who graduate in commercial music want to be commercial musicians. They want to compose, direct or perform music. And some of them will change that aspiration over time because they find something else they prefer to do. But we want to make sure that this year, none of them lose that goal or that focus simply because they can't get a job for a while, or they're running out of money, or they can't find anywhere to live unless they end up stacking shelves. So it's the best we can do to just give our students a bit of support in the 6 to 8 months after they graduate. And our aspiration will be to extend that for longer if we need to. But I think there is a real challenge to us. We talk at open days, and I'm sure when you recruit students, you do something similar about following your passions, follow your dreams, follow your passion into your profession. But if we end up in the short term where there is no access to that profession, I think it resides in universities to find something to do to support those people. And I think it's of great value to society that we do it, because otherwise we may lose one of the guiding lights of the next 10 or 20 or 50 years. We might lose somebody who would otherwise have made a real change by bringing a new voice into acting, art, design, performance, creative music, and so on. They might be lost if we don't support them now. And if we do support them now and they turn out not to be people who change society, we'll still have done a good thing. So for lots of reasons, I think we have to look out beyond graduation to support our students. And we have to get bigger and more agile than we've been before. So this is an artist's impression of what a building will look like in the centre of Bath that will support something we've called iStart, which is a centre that is intended to increase the amount of diversity and the reach to all sorts of people right across Bath of the opportunity to both gain skills and to innovate and to set up their own companies. What we realise is if you look, for example, at an entrepreneurial pathway, you get very high diversity at the entrance to that funnel where lots of people are interested in entrepreneurship. But as you get further down the funnel, diversity just falls away. And what you tend to end up with at the end is a very low diversity set of successful entrepreneurs who set up their own business. iStart is designed to completely challenge that idea and rebuild the idea that actually it's within the diversity of society that the richness of innovation resides. And if we want to be genuinely entrepreneurial, we start by actively seeking out the people with good ideas, rather than allowing, crudely the old boy network to determine who gets through and who doesn't. And that's part of what iStart is intended to do. It will be a concept, a process, a practice, and a building. And it will engage directly with over 70 employers in the region to make sure that what we're doing fits the regional economic aspirations and doesn't sit apart from it, in a way that arguably our university did in the past, because those links are indissoluble now. They're relentlessly truthful in a way that, again, perhaps before the pandemic, they weren't. And then finally, we are starting to get really radical and to bring some of our real flair and richness to bear on some very direct problems. So this is a rather beautiful screenshot from a design company called Little Lost Robot, who design creative robotics for urban spaces and for people and children to play with. And really, Little Lost Robot are absolutely brilliant at producing things that are both visually arresting, phenomenally beautiful, intellectually challenging, and delightful. They create delight. So we're able to support Little Lost Robot through our innovation centre in the studio, but they have also been able to get funding from Arts Council England to use what are called in England meanwhile spaces, that is empty shops and empty factories. They started with one shop front in the middle of Bath, and by being delightful, playful, interactive in these otherwise empty shop spaces, we and Little Lost Robot are able to perhaps contribute to the regeneration of the high street, to bringing people back into these spaces for fun, for play, and ultimately, of course, for retail and tourism. Little Lost Robot have now got further funding from the local council and from Arts Council England to put installations into more shop fronts right across the Bath and North East Somerset region, particularly in some urban centres that are perhaps a little less highfalutin than Bath is, a little bit less posh and a bit less frequently visited. So by being true to our creativity and supporting small companies and entrepreneurs who share that vision of creativity, and by bringing that creativity to bear on the challenges that society has, and in Bath at the moment, that main challenge is around the devastation of the city centre that's been caused by COVID. What we're starting to do is to be both true to ourselves, helpful to society, and helpful to the development of the regional economy in a way that we couldn't even imagine doing 18 months ago. it's something that we can do because we're agile. It's not taking us a year to decide this is a good idea. We're doing it day by day and week by week. And it's something that is making us more deeply relevant to local society and the local economy, which I think is where universities need to be, at the same time as creating those thought leadership spaces and those thought leadership opportunities that might be able to help society navigate the pandemic in a creative rather than a destructive way. It's a small example, but then if we all do it, we only need small examples to change everything. And I'm sure that you, in all your different universities, have other examples of what you've been doing in this space. And so what I'd like to do now is thank you very much for listening. Stop talking and just invite any comments or thoughts that you might have on that kind of intellectual journey that I hope we've taken over the last 3/4 of an hour. So thank you very much for inviting me, and I'll be quiet now.
Thank you very much, Sue.